Hi all, welcome back to the channel. So in this new year, what we're basically going to look at is we're going to start off with a sample here called AI bias. An AI bias basically sort of says, it's looking at the actual patterns of how the model is actually trained, and it's basically going to determine if there's actually any bias within the results of that training. So it's a very important concept because you can actually have a bias within your training, and it could actually influence your results of the way the actual model um, understands and predicts outcomes. So bias is something that you want to kind of limit to a certain point in as much as possible. But there's a very good YouTube video here that you can kind of learn more on. It's basically from Crash Course, and I'll put the actual link into the description as well. And this will kind of explain exactly what kind of bias and fairness actually involves, and gives some kind of great examples on how um, bias actually works in the workplace, and how to try and to eliminate it. But from this point of view, from our point of view, what we're basically going to do is I've created a new application here, so you can sort of see, this the schematic version here, that we're going to kind of start off 2026 with. And this is basically like it's a Docker application which basically loads an adults.csv file, and it starts like a kind of simple model training here for the predictions, and it actually kind of checks to sort of see if men and women are treated differently. So, we'll kind of go through the application now, and then it basically outputs the actual charts so that you can actually sort of see the end result here, um, which will be here. So I'll put, like, you can sort of see there's a chart here which kind of comes in and sort of, talks about the fairness. And this is before, there's any changes, and then there's kind of, after after the actual reweighing of the kind of results. So you can sort of see, here even the selection rate, there's a much more kind of, even keel, but one of these scales here, the TPR and the FNR, they're much more kind of balanced, and all of these kind of charts are a lot more kind of balanced. But we'll kind of go through this now, and make sure that we kind of understand what this fairness is about. So if you look at the application here, I've asked ChatGPT to kind of help us create a good simple Python application here to actually kind of demo what bias is, right? So you can sort of see, like, it's based on adult income data set. So it uses the same kind of libraries that as we normally. And the only thing I'm kind of doing here is actually outputting that bias over to um my downloads folder, because I can't, access the images straight from the Docker container. So I'm just kind of asking, the application to kind of output it to my folder, but it kind of loads in the CSV, and kind of, adds kind of works out the actual columns, and it reads the CSV, and it kind of splits it. That's all kind of quite kind of straightforward itself. Um, and then it kind of goes into, the actual kind of engineering. So it kind of works through all of the actual columns that are based there. And then it starts to kind of train and split the data. So, you can sort of see here that it's doing some kind of funky looking kind of mathematics here to kind of understand, how to actually kind of train and implement the kind of the bias here. And then it's kind of coming back and you have a number of actual methods here. One is like definitely kind of for the let me see. Yeah, so this one here, like, is basically kind of working out in the mathematical ways, how the actual weighting within the kind of ranges will actually kind of work, and then it kind of gives you an actual kind of, prediction as well on these kind of outputs. So it's just kind of reusing the functions here. Um, while it kind of works out, the kind of fairness metrics here, um, and kind of goes through, and then it kind of starts kind of plotting out those kind of graphs that we sort of seen earlier on, and then it kind of does a kind of, training of the actual kind of baseline, and then it kind of starts reweighing everything, and seeing if they can kind of get them more in an even keel. So that's the actual application itself. I mean, I have a README file here. I created this, using a kind of um, a Docker file here, because I didn't want to kind of be using like a virtual environment anymore. But you can sort of see that the kind of Docker file is kind of simple enough here, just kind of, builds out your application and make sure that you kind of have a small kind of slim Python involved here. But that's something we've sort of seen before. And here you can sort of see, there's quite a bit of kind of information that's kind of um, output from the actual application itself, about explanation about what it is and how the actual application is working. But I've kind of put down here, in kind of plain English, right? Because a lot of us are not data scientists or whatever, but your application is training an AI model to predict whether someone earns more than 50,000 per year, then checking whether the model treats men and women differently and trying to reduce the difference. So, it's simply just trying to actually kind of predict whether somebody actually earns more than 50,000, and then actually kind of reduce the difference so that, between the men and women, you don't have that same um, that kind of same big gap that you kind of start off with. And it sort of says here, it does three main things. It learns to predict a rule from historical census data, measures whether predictions differ by sex, male or female, then applies a fairness check and checks if the differences shrinks. So it's it's a good kind of practice to kind of run through, bias first, and make sure that you can actually kind of run any outputs to your AI users through some kind of like application like this, to sort of see, is your model actually having some bias towards, um, age or sex, or anything that, can kind of give kind of preference to one group versus the other. So it says what bias is being measured. The application computes group level fairness metrics on the data set. So the data set itself, is this adult CSV file here. It's comma separated file. So I'm gonna just kind of run through that file. Um, and so this is like here the selection rate of how often does the model predict earns more than 50,000 for each group. So, a male could be, for males it could be like 35%, and for females it could be 18%. Um, so, it's just, if you kind of run through all of these, you sort of see it starts talking about disparate impact ratio, equal opportunity difference, right? So, some of those kind of graphs that we sort of seen, you know, um, then you can kind of, minus them, like the male versus the female from the male, and kind of, false positive rate, false negative rate, all these types of things that we sort of saw in the graphs there, um, a few minutes ago. And they're all kind of important because, as you're kind of working through your kind of graphs, you can actually sort of see, this is why I kind of like this application, because you can actually kind of physically and visually sort of see, what's actually kind of happening between these two kind of graphs, your baseline and then after reweighing. So, it's kind of working out your kind of bias and in that kind of situation. And, there's a lot of information here about what it's actually doing. um, you know, you can kind of extend this out, as you kind of want. Um, you can kind of look at the differences here, the baseline before mitigation, and then after reweighing the kind of results as well. So itself, it's quite a small application. Um, it's not a big application, but if you were to really kind of work by this, it would kind of show you that, the model kind of trained a lot more on the male side of things, when it kind of started off, and then you actually had to kind of reweigh it to kind of balance out those kind of figures. But like I sort of say, the YouTube that I'm going to kind of put, that was a great kind of understanding of bias in the workplace and everything. But I'll kind of just kind of quickly show you here, like, for example, the actual output itself, right? So you can sort of see that when you actually kind of here I'm just, kind of actually kind of running it in a Docker container, like I sort of said, and then making sure that the actual outputs come down to my downloads folder, and you can sort of see, the kind of output files here. But here you can actually kind of go through these kind of figures yourself, like the baseline gaps versus the mitigated gaps, and kind of understand, what the kind of graphs are kind of showing you and what they're trying to kind of show you here, so that you kind of understand, what you kind of started off with, which is would be here, and then versus what you kind of, ended up with, which would also be kind of here. So um the exercise itself was quite good, and it's just to kind of, quick introduction into kind of bias, and what's actually kind of happening here, um, based on these types of, it's a small application just to kind of demonstrate bias, but it seems, that it's an important subject. It's a big subject. A lot of this is going to be kind of, computer science based, but I think the kind of point here is, getting some type of application that can kind of show you, how does an actual model, get some kind of bias, based on some type of metric that's kind of going into the model and going to be used by the model. So, okay, I will leave it there. Thank you.